Sky News Studios in Melbourne, live. The Bolt Report. Now, Andrew Bolt.
Malcolm Turnball. He hasn't just destroyed the Liberal Party. Now he's destroyed his own leadership. His chances of still being Prime Minister by the end of this week, 50-50. By the end of next month, that's getting close to impossible. His credibility is shot, his authority is gone, and today's Ipsos poll shows the government support nosediving to just 45% against Labor's 55%. The Liberals would lose 20 seats. MPs are openly rebelling. Even some cabinet ministers are understood to support a leadership change. And some coalition backbenchers have appealed to Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton, a Conservative, to challenge Turnbull for the leadership. And in an important development, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott has put aside his own ambitions and is publicly backing Turnbull too, as he told a dinner last Saturday of Queensland University young Liberal National Party members.
I want to say, finally, how proud I am of the LSP here in Queensland, how proud I am of my colleague Peter Dutton. Yeah. I look forward to giving every possible support in the days to come.
He meant that deliberately. And by the way, catch that cheering for Peter Dutton? This is history repeating itself. 9 years ago, the Liberals sacked Turnbull as opposition leader for wanting to back a global warming scheme that Labor liked.
I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am.
9 years later, Malcolm Turnbull is on the brink of losing his leadership over exactly the same issue, which symbolises a deeper concern that he is a man of the left trying to lead a party of the right. It was just 6 days ago that Turnbull claimed he'd had an overwhelming victory. His MPs had backed his new global warming policy, called the National Energy Guarantee, to cut our emissions in line with the United Nations Paris Agreement.
We've had a good debate in the coalition party room, overwhelming support for the National Energy Guarantee.
Yeah, right. It was such an overwhelming victory that 13 coalition MPs have now warned that they will vote against this deal if ever Turnbull took it to Parliament. The latest was Senator Jim Molan today.
The concerns that I still have are whether our energy policy is necessary, whether it will achieve any effect on climate, and whether the cost will be worth it.
The answers, of course, are no, no and no. Nothing that this policy does could change the climate. Knowing his leadership was now on the line, the Prime Minister changed that policy on Friday and again today.
The policy that we took to the party room last week has been improved following consultation.
In fact, the dog's breakfast that Turnbull came up with today is basically what he rejected when his great rival Tony Abbott suggested some of the measures first. The best bits are, in this so-called policy, it has no Paris targets to cut emissions. It allows direct investment in new coal-fired power stations. It lets the government force electricity companies to sell, for instance, coal-fired power stations that they'd otherwise shut down, like the Liddell one. And it sets price caps. Those are the good bits. But Labor is, of course, laughing at this third global warming policy in just 6 days.
If you know what his latest policy is, could you let us know?
Now, for at least one coalition rebel, former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, Turnbull's complete U-turn today is enough now for him to keep his job.
We've had the fight, we've got an outcome, and now we move on. I don't think changing Prime Ministers looks good.
And Turnbull today said there is no challenge, certainly not from Peter Dutton.
Peter Dutton was at our leadership group meeting this morning, and he was in the cabinet last night, He is a member of our team. He has given me his absolute support.
Enough of the spin. Let me now tell you why Joyce is wrong and Turnbull does indeed face a possible leadership challenge, maybe even tomorrow, more likely next month. Liberal MPs watching must know this too. If you think that Malcolm Turnbull now presenting a Tony Abbott policy on global warming ends all this, forget it. If the Liberals do now indeed have an Abbott policy on electricity, shouldn't Abbott then be the leader to sell it? How could Turnbull possibly sell all this when he fought these same policies all the way, when he doesn't believe in them, when he says even today that he really does still want those Paris targets made law the moment he can?
Now, where and when we believe there would be sufficient support in the House of Representatives and obviously in our party room to progress this component of the scheme, we'll bring it forward once again.
It is a disaster. But unfortunately for the Liberals, Tony Abbott has been so completely trashed by Malcolm Turnbull and the media. He knows that his colleagues won't choose him, not yet. The media sure wouldn't accept him. And that is why Abbott is backing Dutton, the Conservative, the former copper, the Queenslander who as Home Affairs Minister stopped the boats and can speak plain English. But is Dutton really the best option? Well, frankly, I don't think so. Does he really have the appeal, the breadth of vision to lead, the experience? Well, all that's at best still unknown. And would he win the next election for the Liberals? Well, I wonder who can now after this disaster, whoever leads. But Dutton could well save some of the seats, particularly in Queensland, and he would give the Liberal base some heart at last. You heard that tape I played earlier of coalition students in Queensland cheering and cheering Dutton's name. I asked coalition MPs, when did you hear any of your party members cheer Malcolm Turnbull like that? Sack him and end your humiliation. As I said, 9 years ago, Malcolm Turnbull was sacked as the Liberal leader for pushing global warming policies backed by Labor. Now is facing the sack again for doing pretty much the same. Now let's go back to that first time. Malcolm Turnbull lost the leadership to Tony Abbott, but that was only after another Liberal MP stood up and said, well, if none of you guys are going to challenge him, I will. And that man was Kevin Andrews, a former minister, but still in Parliament. He joins me now. Kevin, it's great to see you. Is it time for another challenge to Malcolm Turnbull's leadership?
It's time at the moment, Andrew, to ensure that we get the policies correct that will reflect what the ordinary people in Australia want. Now, when I walk down the street or I go to a supermarket, as I did on the weekend in my electorate, people are telling me that the cost of living is a real pressure on them, that electricity and utility prices are going through the roof, that their roads are congested and their public transport is overcrowded. They want a government to address these down-to-earth issues of their everyday living experience.
Yeah, but the point is, you're absolutely right. You've got to get the right policies, but then you've got to ask whether the guy in charge is the right man to sell them. Right now, as far as anyone can understand your national energy guarantee, the bits that have now been changed are all Tony Abbott policies. How can you possibly expect Malcolm Turnbull to sell Tony Abbott policies better than Tony Abbott? And the other issues you mentioned, exactly the same. If you now cut immigration, that's a Tony Abbott policy. That's not a Malcolm Turnbull one. Get Tony Abbott to sell it.
Well, the role of the leader of the party is to reflect the policies that are supported by the broad party, both the parliamentary party and the base of our supporters right around Australia, and indeed on an issue like this, the overwhelming majority of Australians, according to the latest polls. So the role of the leader here is to reflect those policies, to advocate for them, and that's what I hope that Malcolm will be able to do in the coming weeks and months. Yeah,
but how can Malcolm Turnbull advocate for policies that he's fought all along? It's only now, today, presented some policies in as far as anyone can understand them. You haven't seen his draft legislation. These are Tony Abbott policies. They're not Malcolm Turnbull's. So how can anyone accept a sales message from Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, they're our policies. They're the policies of the party room. The reality is that we need less verbal gymnastics and more plain speaking to the Australian people. So far as this parliament is concerned, so far as the coalition party room is concerned, there's no way that the neg is going to be resurfaced, whether we want to argue about it being legislation or regulation. The reality is that the neg for at least the term of this parliament is dead in the water. There's a more chance of seeing a Tyrannosaurus in the local suburban street than seeing this legislation come into the parliament.
Look, I hear what you're saying, and, that would be good. Except I also heard Malcolm Turnbull say today that the minute he could, he wants to bring back the policy that you say is dead as the Tyrannosaurus.
Well, that's why I say, Andrew, that it's time for plain speaking. The Australian people, I think, are sick and tired of political spin. They want to hear what the situation actually is. They're concerned about their power prices. They're concerned about their cost of living. We should be addressing that, and we'll address that by saying we're not going to do anything that in any way now or in the future is going to raise electricity prices even further, but we also are going to do the things, use the levers, if you like, that will enable us to start to bring down those prices. And the best way to do that is to actually utilise the vast resources of gas and coal that we've got in this country. That's the conversation we should be having with the Australian people. If you look at last week's news poll, and in terms of this issue, 7 out of 10 Australians and 8 out of 10 coalition supporters want us to do something about power prices. Only 15% of our base have any interest in the Paris targets. The reality is they're not interested in that. They're interested in their cost of living pressures, and that's what I believe we should be addressing.
But I repeat, your Prime Minister said today he still wants the Paris targets, and he will do that the minute you guys let him. I mean, I agree with you. Sell the message that you're talking about, but your Prime Minister still is not on board. Time to ditch him.
Well, Andrew, I understand what you're saying, but the reality is that many of my colleagues and myself believe that this is a wrong-headed approach, that the approach we have to have is a practical one about bringing down power prices. That's what I believe, that's what I want to achieve, and that's what I will continue to advocate with my colleagues. And people can, dance around in verbal gymnastics about this policy or whether a policy continues or not. The reality is it's not going to see the light of day from the coalition in this parliament.
Except, of course, your Prime Minister today said he wishes he could make that policy, and he will have that in mind as soon as he can. You mentioned the polls, you mentioned news poll today. Ipsos poll shows the coalition 45% to Labor's 55%. That would represent, if an election was held now, a loss of 20 seats. You would be absolutely thrashed. Can the Liberals turn this around under Malcolm Turnbull?
We can turn this around if we address the real interests and concerns of the Australian people. And I think there's essentially 3 or 4 things we must do. First thing is that we have to get a handle on energy prices and look at the mechanisms to bring them down. Secondly, we have to deal with the population, immigration, congestion question. And thirdly, we have to look at measures that will address the cost of living pressures where wages have been stagnating for a number of years now and people feel under the pump in terms of their household budgets and their household expenditures. Those matters, and then cleaning up some barnacles on the ship, such as the private schools education matter. And if we address those, then I think we would be in a situation where people would actually give us some credit. I don't think Mr Shorten is very popular. From the conversations I have with Australians, we've got to provide a positive alternative, and the Australian people, I think, would respond to it.
Yes, of course. But the 3 of the 4 issues you mentioned were all Tony Abbott issues that Malcolm Turnbull has attacked. So how you expect Malcolm Turnbull to now turn on a dime and be credible on those issues, I do not know. Could Peter Dutton save the Liberals?
Look, I'm not going to get into speculation, Andrew, about who may or may not be able to be an effective leader in the future. I suspect there's a number of people who could be effective leaders at some stage in the future. I've always believed what Bob Menzies said, and that is if you get the policies right, the politics will follow. And that's why my concentration, not just in the last week or so, but for months now, has been to try and advocate for the policies that reflect the concerns of the Australian people, and that's what I will continue to do.
Now, Peter Dutton, why is Tony Abbott publicly backing him rather than himself as the next leader?
Well, I think what Tony said was slightly misinterpreted by some of the reports in the media today. He basically said that he's worked with Peter in the past and, you know, will be able to effectively work with him in the future, and he's been a good, competent minister, which he has. I've worked with Peter Dutton myself in a variety of roles over the years. So, I mean, seeing all of this at the moment through the prism of leadership, I'm not sure is actually particularly helpful. If we could see this through the prism of the policies that address the challenges of the Australian people, then, as I said, the politics, I think, will take care of itself.
Well, I'm not an idiot. I wouldn't have made presented that clip as I did unless I was absolutely convinced by my own investigation that it meant what I said it meant. Tony Abbott is backing Peter Dutton and not, rather than himself as leader. And I just wonder why he would do that in your view. Do you think he should do that?
Again, Andrew, I don't think it's very helpful for someone in my position to be getting into speculation about matters of leadership. That's entirely an appropriate thing for you as a commentator and an observer of the political process to do, but I'm a participant in it, and what I want to achieve is the best policy outcome. And if we get the best policy outcome, then I think the Australian people will appropriately respond to that.
Yeah, look, I agree you need the best policy outcome, but unfortunately you also need the appropriate spokesperson to sell it. I'm just wondering, today's Ipsos poll is a disastrous number even without all the atmospherics of today. Obviously it was taken a few days ago. If the next news poll, which is the 39th losing news poll, is similarly bad, but there's got to come a time when you say enough, isn't there? When will that time be? And can we see Kevin Andrews reprise his role as the man who put up his hand when no one else dared?
As I said, Andrew, my focus at the moment is on getting the best possible policy that will address rising power prices, rising cost of living, congestion on our roads and overcrowding of our public transports, and the stagnating wages situation that most Australians find themselves in. If we address those, then I'm sure the polls will change.
Very optimistic. Kevin Andrews, may your optimism be rewarded, but let's talk again when it's not. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Always a pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
More later on the leadership crisis in Canberra, but after the break, we'll first have a look at the ABC. It's starting a three-part series today on how global warming is allegedly destroying the Great Barrier Reef completely. But let's talk to the academic who was sacked for warning against just this kind of alarmism.